Okay, great. Okay, so welcome back. Today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Jeff Larson, who is a reporter and news app developer at ProPublica, which is the nonprofit news organization. Does everybody know about ProPublica? All right. We'll hear more. In 2016, Jeff was a Pulitzer finalist for his series Machine Bias, which investigated what ProPublica has called algorithmic injustice. Among the stories in that series, despite disavowals, leading tech companies help extremist sites monetize hate. You may have heard about that story. It popped up not too long ago, last fall, and got quite a bit of coverage. Jeff won a Peabody Award for Hell and High Water, which was another investigation, this one looking at how Houston, before the hurricane, was a sitting duck for the next big hurricane. And the story asked the question, why isn't Texas ready? In 2011, Jeff also won the Livingston Award. For those of you who don't know, the Livingston Award goes to promising journalists under the age of 35, and it's quite a prestigious award. So he won the Livingston for redistricting how powerful interests are drawing you out of a vote. And then, of course, last May, he wrote the story, Any Half-Decent Hacker Could Break into Mar-a-Lago, which he's going to tell us about today. And that story looked at security lapses at President Trump's family-run retreats and how sophisticated attackers could take advantage of vulnerabilities in their Wi-Fi networks. So Jeff is a pioneer at ProPublica in finding innovative ways to use data. Join me in welcoming him.
I'm Jeff Larson. I came to the Bay Area in time for it to catch on fire. So I hope air quality is better down here. My congestion is persistent cough for about a week. So what I currently am doing at ProPublica. Producing journalism that shines a light on the exploitation of the weak by the strong and on the failures of those with power to vindicate the trust placed in them. And what that means in practice is that, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, is that I get to go down to West Palm Beach the day after I have an idea and rent a boat and scan the Wi-Fi at Mar-a-Lago. Because this one's a little bit more fun, and we'll go back. So I had this idea after President Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister were reacting to North Korean missile launch back in February, and I was like, that seems weird. I wonder what the Wi-Fi is like there. Because this is, you can kind of see, but this is a cell phone, and there's another cell phone in this picture right here too. And I thought that maybe national security stuff shouldn't be done on commercial cell phones. In 2015, I wrote a story about how the military was using Android phones that were vulnerable to being hacked by stage fright. So if everybody knows what stage fright was, it was absolutely disaster. You get a text message and it can own your phone. So generals were using Android phones that were vulnerable to this, and they couldn't upgrade them because the procurement process for the United States is so onerous. You have to test everything over and over and over again. So they were using phones that were like 2 or 3 years old at that point. So I thought to myself, well, I can't make out what the phones are in here, but I certainly can use open war driving databases like Wiggle to see if they're using secure Wi-Fi. And I can do one step further, which is we can go down with my friend Surya Mattu, who's a former Bell Labs engineer and works at Gizmodo, and we can actually try and Wi-Fi scan their Wi-Fi to see if they're using standard encryption like WEP, to see if they have anything open, to see if there are any printers there or anything like that. This is the International Golf Club in Palm Beach. We didn't find anything there, but it's such a great picture because we should have been stopped driving past presidential property with a gun, with a thing that looks kind of like a mortar barrel, but we were not. And so we decided to rent a boat because the way Mar-a-Lago is there's one freeway that curves around it, and we kept on driving past it, and we saw a couple of Wi-Fi networks that were completely open, but we needed another vantage point to see exactly how vulnerable they were. So the silliest, stupidest idea I could come up with was rent a boat and drive down the Intracoastal and go and scan the Wi-Fi from the boat. So we stayed out there for maybe 30 minutes scanning the Wi-Fi, and we found an open printer which had a CVE, which means that it has a bug that's registered in a national database that could be exploited on their network. We also found that they were using the weakest form of encryption, WEP, for their network, which if we stayed there a little bit longer and we were not journalists but spies, we could have cracked in just under 2 hours just on this laptop right here and had access to their network. Afterwards, we contacted them. Oh, we also went down to his hotel in kitty corner from the FBI building in Washington, D.C. and sat in the Starbucks and gained access to their network and found that it had a public-facing IP address with software running on it that was last updated in 2006. Somehow, I don't know, some vendor was selling bad things, a version of Apache Tomcat that was just ancient. And we also drove through the golf course on Bedminster a couple days before President Trump showed up, and the networks in Bedminster, New Jersey, which is his golf club in New Jersey, are completely and totally open. So not appropriate for a president or anybody to sort of hang out and do sensitive business on. Now, we don't know, obviously, the president travels with secure tent. They set up a tent that has white noise machines when he's talking on stuff, when he's talking about secure information and top secret information. They also have, like, you can buy a $60,000 phone that's made by Verizon that the president uses when he's, the red phone when he's talking about national security issues. But he also walks around with, it used to be an Android phone and now it's an iPhone. So he has his own personal device that he also uses. It's unclear whether or not he connects to these networks, but people around him connect to his networks. And we talked to enough security experts saying that security experts and former NSA agents saying that anybody who gains access to those networks can turn anything into a listening device or a sufficiently sponsored state attacker. We also went down to the White House and tried to scan the White House, but the White House doesn't broadcast its SSID because they were caught by ZDNet in 2006. The United States government spends $20 million a year securing the White House network and securing Camp David just on cybersecurity alone. So, and that has to do with the fact that over the last 2 years, they've upgraded that network to work with NIPRNet, which is the NSA's internal network. Mar-a-Lago spends $600,000 a year on security, and we couldn't find a line item for cybersecurity. So we went to the Trump Organization. The Trump Organization says that they followed cybersecurity best practices. Fun fact, in 2014 and 2015, the Trump Organization was hacked, and they let loose something on the order of tens of thousands of credit card numbers, almost 1,000 social security numbers of people who had bought residences in the Trump Hotel, and they didn't tell anybody for half a year. And the New York Attorney General fined them $50,000. And that's a small fine, but the New York Attorney General never really fines people for cybersecurity practices. Like, you have to be the worst of the worst. So they follow cybersecurity best practices, which includes their hotels getting hacked. And they said, like, virtually every company these days, we are routinely targeted by cyber terrorists, meaning me on a boat, whose only focus is to inflict harm on great American businesses. And then no comment. And then they have firewall and anti-vulnerability platforms with constant 24/7 monitoring. No one stopped us from doing any of this. We rented a gigantic SUV and parked it right by Mar-a-Lago. So, and also drove right through the golf course of Medminster, which does not have a no trespassing sign. We had to go back and check before that there was absolutely no trespassing signs before we published. The day before we published, we went back and checked. So after we had told them that we'd done it, we went back and drove back through the golf course again. After this, Democrats wrote a letter to the president saying this is absolutely unacceptable. They said that my favorite part is they said cybersecurity experts noted these vulnerabilities could be used remotely to turn on microphones and cameras of devices connected to the network. Cyber criminals in nation states both have the incentive and ability to hack these networks to obtain sensitive information critical to our national security and international diplomacy. To leave these networks unsecured undermines our national priorities and the trust the American people place in the office of the president. It's a little stronger than I would have gone for, but I'm glad that they wrote that letter. The guy who wrote this letter has top secret national security clearance, so or some senators who signed onto this letter have top secret national security clearance. So I believe them when they say that nation states have both the incentive and the ability to hack these networks. By the way, if you guys have $8 million in your nation state, you can buy a house right across from Mar-a-Lago right now because it's on sale. It's like just on the next street over. So let's take this back up a little bit and go back to who am I. So I am a journalist who puts terrible typos in presentations. But I've been working with ProPublica since 2009, so a year after it started, and I am a weird sort of reporter in that I do nerdy things like that, right? So I do everything from data analysis to programming my own visualizations, and I also do regular reporting where I call folks on the phone. Some of the folks I talk to are academics. Some of the folks I talk to have national security clearance. And so this is an article that I wrote back in 2011 that sort of melded this idea of data reporting and on-the-ground reporting. We wrote an article about, so in California, and this is pertinent right now, in California, last time we did redistricting, 2010, we had an independent commission. It was the first time we had an independent commission. What that means is that this commission was going to do everything in the open. It was going to, it was going to take politics out of the redistricting process. And they did do that. They definitely did do that. What, in other states, like where I came from in New York, because I just moved out here over the summer, the process is entirely opaque. There's Hakeem Jeffries, who's a representative from New York, says when he got to draw during one of the redistrictings he was a party to, he went into a room and they handed him a pencil and they were like, draw your district, right? So I'm being a little tough on the redistricting commission right now for a little bit, but it's better than politicians completely drawing their lines. Now, the problem with the redistricting commission in California is the intent of the law was to take politics out of the process, right? So to take so not to allow politicians to draw their own lines. What they did instead is they ignored political actors who showed up. And they just sort of assumed that everybody had a good heart and that when they showed up with sophisticated maps, obviously made on very super high computers, that there was no political motivation there. We found one lobbyist who showed up who said she lived in Southern California her entire life. We looked her up on Nexus. She's never lived in California. She was born and raised in Idaho and still lives in Idaho. And there's a district in Southern California because she came down and gave testimony saying, you know, I'm a member of this community. I've always been a member of this community. So we did a bunch of textual analysis. We had 10,000 pages of redistricting commission testimony that we had to look through, 100,000 pages of emails sent into the redistricting commission where we had to look for groups that were doing, astroturfing campaigns. And then we also were able to cultivate sources, and we got internal emails from the Democratic Party coordinating this campaign, going to every redistricting commission meeting, saying one person showed up and said, we're all horse people here, so we should have a horse district, which I don't understand because horses don't vote, but they were able to get their horse district. They got a very compact district out in Stockton by duping the Republicans into actually supporting their plan. Or what Republicans there are in California. So that's a good model of how we do these things. We also did a bunch of series explaining packing and cracking. We did a music video, if you guys want to watch the music video, which was really great. The redistricting commission in basically all of California yelled at us for this story, which was awesome. We'll be keeping an eye on the redistricting process this time to see if they've changed anything on that. After that, I did sort of an investigation into email targeting. So I asked everybody in 2012, in the 2012 campaign, I asked all of our readers to send in emails that they were getting to try and suss out how people were being targeted with political speech. We ended up getting about 40,000 emails, and we found that largely the Obama campaign was masterful at email targeting and segmentation. They did a lot of A/B testing, but they also were really, really great at targeting and getting out the vote. The Mitt Romney campaign rarely, if ever, did anything more sophisticated than email targeting. Which is good because, these things, you can't get them anywhere else, right? An email is gone. It's in everybody's email inbox. You can't get them anywhere else. After that, about a year after that, in the middle of July, two British journalists showed up. Well, we got an envelope in the mail. And we got an envelope in the mail with a USB drive and another envelope in the mail with a password on it. And usually when that happens, it's some crazy person saying that their BlackBerry's speaking to their heads. But this one was written on the Guardian stationery, so we knew that it wasn't crazy. And on July 4th, I flew to London to look through the Snowden documents. And what I found very quickly was that the NSA had spent billions of dollars trying to undermine public encryption standards, which we're still dealing with the aftermath of. So in particular, they undermined random number generators. So if you guys know about cryptography, that's sort of the cornerstone. but they also made standards weaker. They had a global campaign to make internet standards weaker, which is a public interest story because we all use encryption all the time, right? When we're when we're checking our email or looking up health records or anything like that. So we have an agency that on the one hand is designed to protect American networks. They have a dual role. They protect against intrusion, and they have, and then they also have to have this they have to spy on other countries. And one arm of the NSA was undermining the mission of the other arm. And that was a lot of fun. We continued to work on the Snowden story well into 2015, and we were able to correlate the maps that were in presentations with the locations of every single maps that were in top secret presentations with the locations of where cable entry points come out of the ocean. So when we send things over the internet, the ocean's a problem, right? Because you can't like hang wires. So we have these gigantic fiber optic cables that go underneath, and there's a limited amount of them, and they're all owned by the international telecoms or operated. They have these they call them manholes, where they come out, and then they go to the station and get routed around. My brother's bachelor party was in Oregon, and I showed up a day late because I was going to the AT&T manhole to check it out. And they told me to leave immediately, but I still drove all the way out there. It's up in Oregon. But we were able to correlate those manholes with a bunch of other information in there to really, and public testimony to really pinpoint that this program called Fairview was the NSA's partnership with AT&T, and I don't say partnership lightly. It really was a partnership. They said things like the AT&T has extreme willingness to help us do this massive collection of one-in foreign data, so data coming in from overseas to the United States. So that's a little bit what I've done. We've talked about this guy, which is a little bit fun. And I want to go through what we did last year. And this is where, so that is just a very quick sort of overview of who I am, where I'm coming from. But I want to show how, when we're talking about algorithms, specifically how we dive down and are able to analyze these algorithms for things like bias and unfairness. So when we talk about algorithms, the algorithms that we're going to look at, we're not talking about things like sorting an array or some of the traditional computer science-y type algorithms. We're talking more about the statistic-based sort of algorithms. So we're going to look at one which is a criminal risk sentencing algorithm. And we're going to look at another one, which is a car insurance. And the thing that people don't sort of seem to realize is that algorithms, when you define them not necessarily as computer-based or deep learning, when you define them as using computers to make decisions in general, we have a long history in the United States, in the world, of doing this. So everything from health insurance to car insurance to, we're going to look at risk scores. The field extends far further than just Twitter and Facebook in the way that they assign ads to you or think that you're going to respond to advertising. So we did this series, Machine Bias, and our first real big one was, in May last year, and it was this story called Machine Bias about this algorithm called Compass, which is an acronym for something that I can't remember, and it's used in New York. It's used in a number of states. It's used in New York. It's used in all throughout Wisconsin, from like the time you start talking to any law enforcement professional to the time that you are released from jail. You get scored and scored and scored and scored and scored. And it also is used in Broward County, Florida. So we asked New York for it. They said no way. We asked Wisconsin for it. They said no way. And we said why? And they were like, well, because it's proprietary. You can't have these scores. Which is weird because we filed a public records request for data that the government held. And the government said, well, yeah, well, we have access to the data. You can't have it because it's a private company that gives us access to the data, which was disappointing. We went to Broward County and they said, okay, we can give it to you. That'll be $10,000. And so what we did, like any good journalist would do, is we hired a lawyer and then they gave it to us for free. So it cost us about $400 to do it. And we entered in on, so a little bit about the algorithm. The way the algorithm works is when you're arrested, the day you're arrested, they ask you 137 questions, anywhere from a series of questions, anywhere up to 137. Sometimes they'll ask you 50, sometimes they'll ask you 20, sometimes they'll ask you all 137. They feed it into a classifier that tries to predict how likely you are to recidivate within 2 years, to go on to commit another crime, right? So the entire goal of the algorithm is from the day you answer all these questions to 2 years from now, how likely is it in that time period are you going to go on to commit another crime? They do this in Florida and Wisconsin before trial. So this has ethical considerations. We have a criminal justice agency using software to essentially label you high risk or more likely to be guilty before you're proven innocent. It's like the inversion of how we think about criminal justice, right? It's supposed to be the other way around. We have this presumption of innocence. This algorithm tests a presumption of guilt. So we got 18,000 records of everybody who was scored in Broward County since they essentially started it. I think we got it from 2013 to 2016. And the first thing we did was plot it on a bar chart. And we said, huh, that's interesting. You know, we did a bunch of bar charts, and this one really struck out at me. It looks like these are deciles, so they're supposed to be 10%. Everybody gets assigned a 10% bucket, and from the lowest risk to the highest risk. It looks like it's working as advertised for African Americans, ethical considerations aside, in that we have about 10% of our sample every single time. But if you look at Caucasians, something is breaking down here. We don't have 10% of Caucasians in every single risk score bucket. In fact, it looks like, you know, the Caucasians are overall safe. Right? So this looks like there could be some sort of skew or bias or something like that in it, but we can't prove it because this is just the scores, right? We then need to go and we need to look up all 18,000 people in our sample and look at their criminal records. So we get this data after 3 months of fighting with Florida. And then we're like, oh, hey, can you also give us the jail booking data? And they were like, we could, but we'd have to give you all of it. And we thought that would be just too unwieldy to have all of it, which is sort of a failing on my part. Because they couldn't because the Broward County said there's no way to join the scores with arrest history. In their databases, the way that they do it is they look at people's first name, last name, and date of birth. And so that was a very sad day. We asked them for it all, and they said we'd have to give it to you all, and it would cost like some extraordinary amount of money, and we didn't want to hire another lawyer. And we were like, okay, so how about this? how about we just write some software to scrape your site? And they were like, yeah, sure, that's totally fine. Go to town. Just like, and that's never happened to me in my entire life, that I've been talking to anybody who's just like, scrape our site. So that was a joyous moment. And we would scrape their site, and their site would go down, and we'd call them up, and they'd turn the computer on and off, and then we'd keep on scraping it. Because it was sitting at the county courthouse. There was just a server that they just could reboot. And we did that for 6 months, mostly because the data was so messy, right? It's all hand entered. There's no real identifier that we can join back and forth together. People will have a criminal record entered into one name or date of birth, and then if you like spell it a slightly different way, you have more booking records. We also had to check to see that they didn't go to state prisons, so we had to get all of the state prison records and join it all together. And it was 6 months. We ended up out of those 18,000, we ended up being able to match 7,000 really, really well. We estimate there's about a 3% error rate of missed records in there, just by doing statistical sampling. And what we were able to find, was that this wasn't just that white people are safer in Florida. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a regression model at you, because this makes our case the best. What we did is we ran a logistic regression, which is essentially, like a classifier. Most people use it like a classifier, but the great part about logistic regression is that it gives you odds that a particular characteristic, when a particular characteristic is there, odds that someone will get a higher score, for example, right? So when it's positive and it has 3 dots next to it, it means that there's a significant bias, or it has a significant relationship to getting your score. If it were entirely a fair classifier, we would expect things that have to do with criminality and possibly age to be really, really high and significant, right? So you can see that it does predict pretty well, because we have this 2-year recidivism. So we asked the computer, hey, does this score actually, if you actually go on to recidivate, did you get a higher score? And the answer is yes, you were more likely to get a higher score. With every prior that you committed, you were likely to get a higher score. If you committed a misdemeanor and not a felony, you got a lower score, which is great. And then there's an intercept there. What we didn't, and then also age is a factor too, just because it's intuitive, right? If you're older, you don't have enough time to do more crime, right? Like if you're 45 and you're still out there boosting cars, like this is probably your last go around. You have enough time if you're less than 25 to do it, right? But what we wouldn't expect is any sort of race numbers to light up, right? We would expect maybe like this Asian one, or if I think, what is that, other, or Native American, to sort of, maybe a small effect, but not a gigantic effect. And we saw, compared with white people, we saw African Americans with an increase in log odds so an increased log, 45% more likely to get a higher score than white people, even controlling for other information like the number of priors you have, what crime you committed, that kind of thing. This was a very surprising result, because we don't think, when we're presented with a score or a classifier, we think the computer has done some fair math to even this out. We still don't know why this is the case, because while we have access to the 137 questions, we were able to get via sourcing and via FOIA requests and a lot of research, we were able to get a number of the questions that were on the COMPASS questionnaire We have no idea how they weight those questions. And some of those questions are a little weird, like how often do you call your mother? I don't know how you're supposed to answer that. How many people do you know who have been incarcerated, which among races will be wildly different given the history of incarceration in the United States. Harper's did sort of like made a little poem out of them that you can read if you want to. And then there's a whole bunch of like psychometric things like criminal thinking, like do you believe that it's okay to steal food if you're starving, right? Like how do you answer that question? Or if your kid is starving, which is even more emotionally centered. That is supposed to predict your 2-year recidivism. So that was fun. Now the thing that's strange about this, and the thing that a lot of people called us out on, is it's relatively equally predictive. So it makes the right guess, maybe for the wrong reasons, but it makes the right guess overall. So you can see this is what's called a survival curve. This is the amount of people who have recidivated, the amount of remaining people in each bucket, high, medium, or low, who have recidivated after 10 years. So you can see that this line for white defendants pretty much lines up with this line for black defendants. So it's equally accurate. How do you reconcile these two things? What ends up happening is it over-predicts African Americans, right? African Americans have a higher rate of recidivism. So what the classifier does is when it picks up on, in Broward County, when it picks up on things that are correlated with the ways African Americans are answering the question, it classifies those folks as more dangerous than they actually are, because it's going to be rewarded by doing that, because there is a higher rate of incarceration and crime in African American communities. What that means in practice is there are a lot more African Americans who are being rated more dangerous than they actually are, being rated as likely to go on to recidivate, but not doing it. When we looked at simple truth tables and added these numbers up, what ended up happening is African Americans who were rated highly likely to go on to recidivate, they were 45%, it guessed wrong 45% of the time. So it guessed wrong half of the time. For white people, it guessed wrong 23% of the time. So they were twice as likely to be labeled as a risk of recidivism 2 years down the road and actually not go on and do it. And this is a problem, right? But from the algorithm's point of view, if you just look at the accuracy, by making that decision, the algorithm comes out looking relatively fair. This was a problem for us, and this was a problem for academics and data science practitioners worldwide. I honestly didn't think that some weirdly spelled algorithm used in Florida with a 67% accuracy rate overall would be, for criminal justice, it would become national news and spark a national debate as much as this story did. Because this is a problem anytime you do classifiers. If you have a group with one, anytime you make a classifier, so if you're talking advertising, or anytime a computer is making a decision, if you have a group with a higher prevalence and a group with a lower prevalence, it's going to over-predict the group with the higher prevalence just to equal out those error rates. And we do this all the time in healthcare, right? So people, they take tests and then they fit them to their local population and they stratify across groups to make sure that this thing works. We're not doing that here, and I'd argue that we're not doing that when we run classifiers and and computer-aided decisions in production. The other thing I want to point out, so it's a little heavy, but the other thing I want to point out is this is the difference in accuracy between women and men. And I want to show you that this red line right here, which is the high factor for this survival rate, is exactly the same as the medium line for survival rate for men. And we pointed that out to the company, and they said, oh yeah, we make an add-on to our software. So what this is saying that a high-risk woman is only as dangerous as a medium-risk man, which is a serious problem. We pointed it out to the company, and they were like, oh yeah, we make an add-on that law enforcement people can buy to fix exactly this problem, but Broward County didn't buy it. And we were like, what? So here's our truth tables. You can see, I want you to look at the false positive rate. So the false positive rate, which is we've labeled people more dangerous than they actually are, is 45% for African Americans, and it's only 23. It makes the opposite mistake for white defendants, because if you have a lower base rate, you're just going to guess, and you can pick up on answers that are correlated with white defendants. You're just going to guess that they're going to be safe, which is exactly what we saw in the bar charts at the very beginning. We saw that skew to white defendants being totally safe. You can see that the false negative rate, which is we said you were safe, but you then went on to commit more crime. White defendants have a false negative rate of almost 50%, and black defendants have a false negative rate of almost 28%. So that was fun, but that's not the beginning and the end of the story, right? That's all the math behind it. We still needed to go to Broward County and find people who were affected by this to tell a compelling story. These two guys, Vernon Parker and Dylan Fugit, were both arrested for the same crime. I think they had a misdemeanor drug possession or something. And he went on to, never go back to jail. And this guy, I think, has been back to jail twice. He got an 8, he got a 2. So, and we have a whole bunch of them. My favorite is Brescia Borden and Vernon Prater. Brescia Borden was a teenager. She was 18, 19. She was walking home from school and she saw a kid's bike, and she decided to pick up that bike and ride around with it, just being a teenager. The mom came out and said, "Give me back my kid's bike." She gave back the kid's bike, but the neighbor had called the cops on her, and she went to jail for riding around on a kid's bike, and was scored an 8. She did have priors. We don't know what they are because they were when she was a minor. This guy, Vernon Prater, had had violent assaults. He had he was arrested for stealing $4,000 worth of electronics, I think, and had many priors. And when I think when we talked to him, it was either him or the other guy. He was like, "Yeah, that score doesn't seem right, right? I'm not. There's no way I'm a 2." And he later. Afterwards, he later got out and he held up another electronics store for $10,000. And Brescia Borden now has a criminal record and a high risk score, but is doing all right and is like going to school and getting her GED. The next one that I want to talk about that impacts a lot more folks, but weirdly wasn't as controversial as that first one, is our investigation into car insurance. And we found that redlining is alive and well and often defended by algorithms in many states. What we did is we looked at, we bought car insurance quotes from a private provider. So the way car insurance works is it's just a simple formula. It's a formula with many factors, but basically you take a base rate and you multiply it by an increase or a decrease for every one of your characteristics as a driver. So you start out with $800, and if you have, if you're a woman, you get maybe a break of like 90, you take 5% away of that. If you have DUIs, you double it by 2, such and such and such. And then all the way at the very end, what they do is they add in where you live. And that makes a certain amount of sense, right? If you live in an area that is very congested, there will be more claims. They won't be as expensive because you're driving at slower speeds. If you live in a rural area, there will be fewer claims, but every one of those claims will cost more money because you're driving 80 miles an hour and you're going to slam into somebody, right? So they try, at the very end, they do geography-based pricing. And what we found was that in the 4 states that we looked, including California, for a number of companies, in California it was 6 companies were charging 10% more for minority neighborhoods based with the same risk versus non-minority neighborhoods. And we did it by looking at the same profile, a 30-year-old woman safe driver, asking what the quote was, and then compare it to the underlying risk. So how much car insurance companies expect to pay out when they sign a premium. And we found in California, 6 were charging more than 10% for African American neighborhoods. We found in Texas, it was about 6 out of 30 again. In Illinois, it was 30 out of 31 companies were charging more than 10%. Same deal in Missouri. And I don't even need to do any regressions. This is sort of, they're squiggly weird graphs, and I apologize for the color scheme. But the red line is the average price charged for a minority neighborhood, and the blue line is the average price charged for a white neighborhood. So on average, and this is Illinois, on average, you can see, and the x-axis is the risk. You can see that on average, African Americans or minority neighborhoods in Illinois are being charged far more, sometimes as much as twice as more, like in Farmer's case on average, than white neighborhoods with the same risk. We did the same trick where we went and we found 2 people who had car insurance policies in Illinois. We found this guy. He basically can't afford his rent in his car insurance is something like $1,800. He's a safe driver. He's never been in an accident. He's a young guy. Young guys pay more money for car insurance than older folks up to a point. But his state, and we looked at the risk in his neighborhood. He needs it to drive his car to work, right? He needs to get to, he lives in the south side of Chicago. He needs to get to the north side to drive to work. The busing is not so, buses are not, and public transportation is not so good in Chicago, so there's literally no way he could keep his job if he didn't have his car. And he can't move anywhere else because his car is so expensive, right? And he's never been in an accident, safe driver. We found another couple, this guy and his husband, and interestingly enough, joint policies are sometimes cheaper than buying individual policies, something I know is car insurance. I don't know why. They think that you're both driving the car 50% of the time, so if you have 1 car and 2 drivers, like there's less chance for an accident. A safe driver and a non-safe driver, it's just some weird quirk. Car insurance companies also like to sell joint policies like that because they think that people will be more fiscally responsible because you have 2 people responsible for the car. Anyway, we found this guy and his partner, and his partner, when he was, I don't know, 23, 24, he had 2 hit and runs, which is supposed to, like, you're not supposed to be insurable at that point. And their car insurance was cheaper than this guy, right? And he lived in a majority white neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. Same exact city, right? We're still talking about Chicago. We're still talking about similar levels of risk, according to the state risk, wildly different outcomes. The way that we were able to figure out what was going on here is a little trick of mathematics. What car insurance companies do is they create territories, right? So if you guys are familiar with the history of insurance, insurers aren't really good at creating territories. And historically, their territories were red lines, and a red line is nobody gets insurance here, right? And it was, and they were brought before courts all across the country. It's a practice called redlining, because those red line neighborhoods would undoubtedly be always African American neighborhoods. We just don't sell to those people, right? It was a very racist practice. What they do now is they use clustering algorithms to cluster areas where they have a lot of, they call experience. So they've sold a lot of policies. Those policies, they know how risky someone's going to be within this well-defined area. What we found was that these clustering algorithms weren't doing very well. They were clustering a lot of rural, more white neighborhoods together, and not taking into account neighboring neighborhoods that have maybe a little bit of higher risk. When you take a distribution of values, right, high risky rural neighborhoods and low risky rural neighborhoods, what will happen, the more that you can glom together, is you'll get that distribution will just become the state average overall. And you can see that happening, right? You can see car insurance is supposed to go up as the price goes up. But at a certain point in Illinois, it starts going back and regressing to this average, right? So if this is the average risk right here, it starts regressing. And what's happening is all of these white neighborhoods over here are being grouped into these neighborhoods over here, making it look like they're safe when they aren't necessarily safe. And what happens when you do that, these guys all have to stand on their own, and they get charged far more. It gets worse than that, because in California, at first, the car insurance regulator yelled at us and said, "We don't know what we're doing, we're dumb journalists, just stay in your lane." But a couple weeks ago, they said, we actually did go back, and I'm sorry, the color scheme's reversed here, but it's the same graph. We actually did go back and we looked at nationwide, which is good because we looked at nationwide. And we looked at their internal data. And if you look at their internal data, not the state risk, because they accidentally filed it and it said proprietary, do not publish, which is always great. That's how you know you're on like you're having a good day when you find proprietary, do not publish. We found that according to their internal data, there still was this separation between the two things, even before doing their clustering, right? Like their raw loss, they knew that they were charging people more. The car insurance regulator in California called us up a couple of weeks ago, and they were like, we need to talk to you guys about something. And they showed us a bunch of very confusing graphs, and it slowly dawned on us that they were using this method, the method that like I invented, to regulate car insurance in California. So going forward, they're going to start using our method to make sure that there's no bias in the rates in California. Because in California, unlike most states, they have we have a insurance program for underserved neighborhoods, what they call underserved neighborhoods, and it's actually written into the law that you can't do this sort of thing in more specific ways than it is in other states. In Texas, it's written into the law that as an insurance company, you have to make a profit, so that's special. In Michigan, there's like a loose law that says no discriminatory practices, but they don't have anything in place to, in Illinois, they don't have anything in place to actually enforce that. And this is the final one I'm going to talk to. What time is it? Are we still?
We got about 15 minutes.
Okay, great.
So leave some time.
I will. Just very quickly, I need your help. If you guys use Chrome or Firefox, we're collecting political ads on Facebook. and you use Facebook, we're collecting political ads. The idea being that this is political speech, and we should collect it as a society to sort of keep the powers that be in check. Here's what I found so far. These are ads that we've collected, ads other people are seeing. So Nancy Pelosi, even though it's not an election year, these are political ads that are running on Facebook right now. Nancy Pelosi is already campaigning. We got Paul Durham of Tucson. There's a campaign, Beto O'Rourke, and we got the President of the United States is advertising on Facebook right now. He advertises about twice a day, every day. So it's an extension. It's open source. If anybody wants to chip in, you can do that. Okay, great. Yes?
Question.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing how you discover anomalies. Did you monitor statistical anomalies and then go further to investigate data, or did you first hear about anecdotes or off-the-record stories and then start to look into statistics? So how did you approach the anomaly?
It happens in both ways. For the machine bias, Eric Holder. We got tipped off on this because Eric Holder, former Attorney General, very famously said someone should look into these things. These things scare me, and we should look into whether or not they're different across races. So the Sentencing Commission of the United States said, "No, we're not going to do that. That seems hard." And we basically said, "You're wrong. It's not hard." And it was hard. It was a year of our lives. And so we looked into it for that. For car insurance, on the other hand, the way that I originally did it was just create a billion graphs, right? Like just sort of like graphs and correlations and just look for anything, right? And I looked at income. I looked at size of household. I looked at the density of cars. I basically thought car insurance was way more complicated than it was. Because car insurance is just a simple equation, even though they file like 10,000 page PDFs. And really the only variable is where people live, right? Only global variable is where people live. They don't take into account, they're not, especially not in California, they're not supposed to take into any account other than loss, right, which is the loss cost. So I ran all of these things, looking at all of these things, and then I realized that, and I was like, well, okay, I can go to the census, and I can look at the variables there. And so I started out with a gigantic regression with a lot of variables, and then I saw race pop right out to the top, and I was like, huh, that's interesting. So it happens one of both ways. Either a source tips us off to it. We always do that exploratory analysis beforehand. So we always run like simple bar charts like this to see if we're onto something. Because before we're going to jump into a year-long investigation, we don't want to be hunting down that road. That being said, we have done that before where we think we find something and we just don't end up writing about it. And I have a gigantic bag if anybody wants to see all of my bad ideas, like airline pricing, like you name it, I've looked at it. But yeah, it's a mixture of both, and it depends on the thing.
We're going to have Matt and then Ian and then Daniel.
Okay.
Yeah. So my question kind of relates to what extent should the government kind of regulate the cybersecurity practices of private businesses? I guess having one business have an open Wi-Fi network isn't that much of a threat, but as a collective, there are millions of businesses whose security practices are out of date, and that can be a big risk to our cybersecurity culture. So I'm just curious what you think as a role of government and
I'm of two minds of this. One mind is that data breaches should definitely be regulated, right? Like this is a harmful thing in modern society, right? Like that this happens, and there should be penalties. Like the Attorney General definitely brings cases against cyber breaches, and the FCC and the FTC definitely write opinions and regulate those things. Now, the downside of doing that is we have this process called FIPS. You know about FIPS? Okay, so FIPS is the Federal Information Processing Standard. And when you make something that has like cryptography or security software or anything like that, and you want to sell it to the federal government, you have to undergo this lengthy process that sometimes can take as long as a decade. Now, at that point, you're selling, this is exactly the point when I was talking about cell phones. At that point, you have a standardization process that is harming security because it takes a long time to get in to, they have a bunch of them. There's like FIPS, there's NIAPS, there's CCE. To get that approval takes so long and is so onerous, and the standards are never updated that they actually end up being insecure by default. And then we have generals walking around with Android phones that are vulnerable to stage fright because they literally can't upgrade them, because if they upgrade them, they're no longer certified. So in terms of data breaches and stuff like that, there should, you know, as a journalist, I think that it definitely is the case that increased penalties for these things would increase the cybersecurity practices. That definitely is the case. But also, you have to watch out because you don't want to regulate too soon or too early, because then you end up encoding bad security practices in general.
Sure. So you touched on Facebook briefly. I was curious if you could speak a bit more about the work that Google is doing, looking at Facebook advertising.
Sure.
And I read specifically about showing ads that are targeted to specific demographics to broader groups, just to. Yeah.
So one of the things we're doing here is it's a pain in the neck, but we're collecting the demographics and the targeting information from each of these political ads, so we can see how people are targeting you. Last year, 2 years ago maybe, we collected 50,000 ad categories that they have, so they can put you in things like soccer moms who like drinking is an ad category. I don't know how many there are, but and there's a whole ton of them. And what we found out is, I worked a little bit on the story, but not a whole bunch. But what we found out is you could target an ad. You can't exclude white people from the ad, but you can exclude African Americans or Asians or any minority, right? Now the problem with that is it's illegal in the United States to do that if you're running a housing ad, you know, an ad for housing under the Fair Housing Act. So we ran an ad. We had, thankfully, a housing series coming up where we were talking about access to housing. And so we ran our ad, and we excluded African Americans from our ad. And we went to Facebook, and we were like, this is illegal. And they're like, I don't know what law you're talking about. And we were like, are you a lawyer? And he's like, yes, but I mostly do privacy. So, conversely, if you tried to run that ad in like the New York Times, say, the New York Times looks for trigger words. So you can't get it past. They have a single guy that sits there and looks at every housing ad that runs in the New York Times, and you can't say things like people like you, right? You have to also have fair representation. If like a person's face shows up in your housing ad, you have to have a bunch of people's face shows up, and they won't do it. So that was one of them. The other one that we found was that Facebook had learned more ad categories on top of soccer moms who like to drink, and we found out that via source that you could type in, you could target to Jew haters, which was a thing up until a couple of weeks ago, that Facebook had learned people were interested in hating Jews, so you could target them with ads. The algorithm was very helpful. It said that was too small an audience, but there are people who are similar who are interested in the Second Amendment if you also want to target ads to them too. So we wrote that story, and that became sort of like the next day everybody typed in, all journalists everywhere typed in very sketchy things to every advertising platform, and they found out that like Google did it and Twitter did it, and someone wrote about LinkedIn doing it. So all of these algorithms were allowing people to target based on hate speech, essentially.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Algorithms making up the categories, or people?
People type them in, and then when they become, sorry, I wasn't clear. It's like an interest on your Facebook profile. So there's enough people, and then there's some normalization of that stuff. And then what the algorithm does is it does lookalike audiences. So people who are interested in hating Jews also like the Second Amendment.
Daniel, do you have a question?
I think thank you for the dialogue. It's a pretty exciting dialogue. But can we go back to this graph with the uniform distribution of, not this one, where you have two distributions side by side?
Yeah.
Yeah, so why do you think that they should look similar in the first place?
Well, it's a decile score. I think they should look similar in the first place because of our logistic regression model. They should look more similar than they do here.
So how do you actually work with any data scientists? Because like a lot of what you're saying sounds like frankly bad science to me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's okay.
Like for instance, like these.
We had 2 PhDs here working on this one, and we had 6 PhDs working on this one.
So what happens very often is that if you look at the ranges of predictors, there could be a lot of like certain factors. For instance, income can be a very strong predictor.
Yeah, we threw income in there.
Income is highly correlated.
We threw income in there too, and took it out because we didn't know the income of the people in there, right? We would have to do the income of the individual blocks in Broward County and find out where all these people live. Income being correlated to race doesn't also, but that also, is it income or race? Well, that's an answer that we always ask, and we can't really figure it out because there is a correlation there, right?
Maybe,
So,
but that's not the problem with the algorithm, right? So the algorithm gets the data as a funnel, so it has no responsibility for increasing income and even minorities for that matter.
sure.
Also, I think there was another issue with your prior half presentation on the security, right? Like, do you realize that security is not free? So there is like a high cost of like.
I understand, but if the United States,
There's always like a balance you have to struggle, and the fact that you like roam around and find some other system doesn't necessarily mean that.
But I understand that, but the United States government spends $20 million every year on securing the president's communications. And if he's hanging out at a place that has zero budget that we can tell for cybersecurity communications, that's a national security risk. Also, a place that has been fined by the New York Attorney General is the worst of the worst. The New York Attorney General has a lot on his plate, especially, with all of the corruption that happens in New York, and isn't necessarily going after cybersecurity. It's not one of his things. You have to be really, really bad. And what they did was they were hacked. They were hacked repeatedly in 2015 and the beginning of 2016. And they didn't tell the people who had their credit card stolen, which is a violation of the law, right? Like if you leak private information that someone gave you, entrusting you with that information, like if I did that, right, if I took your credit card number and posted it on Twitter, I would go to jail, right? So not telling people, the way that the New York Attorney General found out was the credit card providers actually told the New York Attorney General saying, hey, these credit cards are, the last charge is always at the Trump Hotel. And this was going on for months and months and months and months. Right? So yes, cybersecurity and security is not cheap and is expensive, but the stakes are very high where we are when we're talking about the President of the United States.
I just want to, thank you again for that. So disclosing these kind of problems is exactly what the journalism. My last note would be the cost of the cybersecurity, not necessarily the investment and the actual efforts to secure devices. Most of that comes from the fact that the more secure network is, the more it cuts off the collaboration and the harder it is to work.
Yeah.
It's something to really keep in mind.
I mean, yeah, sure, but NIPRNet and CIBRNet are national network, and there are more than 1 million people with top secret security clearances. I would say that having an open network at a place where you're talking about and not talking about SCIFs at a place where you're talking about national security in an open air network where there could be a reporter or a nation state adversary on a boat 800 feet away is not responsible to happen, especially when you travel with a facility.
How do you secure your own tech setup?
Compartmentalization, so I have multiple computers, I have multiple phones. I have a phone for home, I have a phone for work. I run firewalls and alerting systems. And we do a lot of air gapping, and we have our own SCIF, so.
Okay, well, we're out of time.
Thank you.